Welcome to Chapter 9. We're now moving into adolescence, and in Chapter 9 we will look at the physical and cognitive development in adolescence, concentrating on three major topics: physical changes, issues in adolescent health, and adolescent cognition. So let's begin with physical changes in this first video. We will be looking at puberty, the brain, and adolescent sexuality. So let's begin with puberty. What's it all about? What's the defining characteristic of puberty? Why do we experience puberty? Well, it is the mechanism, I guess, that makes us reproductive or reproduce, gives us the ability to reproduce. I guess that's the way I'll put it. And this is really the defining characteristic, is that we move from not being able to reproduce to being able to reproduce. That is what puberty is about in humans as well as in animal species. Puberty is defined as the ability, to reproduce. So obviously a lot of other things go on at the same time, and we can define it here as a period of rapid physical maturation occurring primarily in early adolescence that involves hormonal and bodily changes. Lots of changes in hormones, lots of changes in body. But once again, the real defining characteristic is that you become reproductive. All right. Once again, there are many other changes that go on as well. Sexual maturation is really the defining characteristic, but your height changes, your weight changes. You get facial and chest hair in males, so hair is appearing in all sorts of different places, pubic hair as well, breast growth in females, other changes as well. The hips widen in females, the jaw lengthens in males. You get voice changes going on. So there's a number of different physical changes. But once again, the defining characteristic is to become reproductive. And this moment of becoming reproductive is marked with menarche for females. That is the girl's first menstruation. That is the sign that she is now releasing ovum, releasing eggs into the system, and she can now reproduce. There's a similar mechanism for males, or similar characteristic, and it's known as spermarchy. I don't have it on the overhead here, so just you can spell it out, spermarchy. And it represents the boy's first ejaculation of sperm, and that is, the moment that the male becomes reproductive. So there is a defining moment that kind of signifies what puberty is all about, and when the major change takes place. But once again, when we look at puberty as a whole, there's a growth spurt, there's bodily changes that are listed here that go on, and it takes several years for the whole process. Let's look at some of these changes that go on. First of all, with the growth spurt, we can see females and males compared here from one particular study, looking at the timing of the pubertal growth spurt for boys and girls. And you can see in the graph here that certainly females experience their growth spurt earlier than males by a couple of years, but the height gain per year, inches per year, that males, their growth is somewhat more accelerated at the peak. They're actually gaining more height than females are at their peak. I have a little chart just to represent some of the important numbers from this graph here. Let me just quickly go to the whiteboard. And we'll see that for girls, the growth spurt begins at about 9 years of age. for boys at about 11 years of age. So it's a 2-year difference. Once again, this is true as well for the peak rate. When there's girls and boys growing at their maximum rate. For girls, it's around 11 and a half years of age. For boys, once again, 2 years later, around 13 and a half years of age. And as I mentioned when we looked at the graph, the maximum peak rate is greater for boys than for girls. It's somewhere around the neighborhood of 4 inches a year that they will reach, whereas girls can reach up to about 3.5 inches per year. Going back to the PowerPoint. There are a number of hormonal changes that take place during puberty. There's some fairly drastic hormonal changes. Hormones, of course, are chemicals secreted by our endocrine glands that carry throughout the bloodstream and affect different areas of the body. The hormone or the endocrine system, you can kind of think of it as in a sense, it's like a rapid communication system that can affect all parts of the body. So hormones are kind of chemical messengers that travel through the bloodstream. For instance, when we're in a fight or flight situation, we have hormones that rapidly go throughout our bloodstream that affect parts of the body, from head to tail, really. I mean, we have, our breathing increasing and the heart rate increasing. We have our hair standing on end on our skin and our head, and as well as our skin. We have our pupils changing and our digestion system changes. I mean, there are rapid changes, just as an example, the stress response. There are rapid changes throughout the body. This is what the endocrine system does. It carries hormone messengers that causing changes throughout the body. Well, with puberty, we know that there are massive changes throughout the body as well. We have bones that change, and we have the growth spurt, and we have changes in the reproductive the biology of the reproductive system. And so this is kind of the purpose of the endocrine system. The main endocrine glands involved in puberty are the gonads. The gonads are the testes in males, the ovaries in females. They are the major endocrine glands involved in puberty. Okay. The specific hormones that change the most and are the most involved in puberty are testosterone and estradiol. We will take a look at the difference in these two types of hormones in males and females and how much they increase on the whiteboard again. And once again, this is from one particular study. They looked at changes in hormone rates during puberty, and you can see in the green ink here that testosterone, it doubled for girls. That's the 2 times, whereas for males, their testosterone increased by a factor of 18 times higher. So you can see that testosterone, we do think of this as a male hormone. It is present in both females and males, so it is increasing, it's doubling in females during puberty, but we think of it as a male hormone because you can see 18 times higher in males during puberty. So males, have much more rapid increase in testosterone. For estradiol, this is a type of estrogen. And we think of this as a more of a female hormone. Once again, it's present in both sexes. For males, you can see under the boys column that it doubles. Their level of estradiol doubles, whereas for girls, it increases by a factor of 8 times higher. So we get this rapid increase in hormones in both boys and girls during during puberty. I mean, 18 times higher testosterone, for boys, 8 times higher estradiol or estrogen for girls. I mean, like, so this is major influx of hormones in the endocrine system. Let me go back to the PowerPoint here. Okay, here we go. Okay. The timing of puberty is affected by a number of factors, actually. First of all, there are genetics at work. I mean, we are born with a kind of a basic genetic program that's hardwired into our species. I mean, we we all go through puberty at approximately the same time in our development. I say approximately. There can be differences of years, but you don't wait. There aren't some people waiting till 20 or 30 to go through puberty, and people aren't going through puberty at 5 years of age. I mean, we have kind of a window of when puberty is going to take place. Typically, early adolescence for most people, and this is, once again, this is kind of set by your genetics. Different species will reach puberty at different times based on their genetic code. So first of all, we have a hardwired kind of program in our genetics to say when we should go through puberty. But then the timing can also be affected by environmental factors, and we know this because the average age of menarche, that is first menstruation for girls, has declined significantly since the mid 19th century. Um, so it's been going down. The average age has been going down since the mid 18, in the mid 18 since mid 1800s. We can see this in this graph here, and there's a number of data from a number of different countries, and you can see the data going all the way back to about 1850, at least for Norway, and this chart here goes up to about 1970. So we have data from 1850 to 1970, so over 100 years. And look at, they're for all five of these countries, you can see the rate of menarche decreasing. So in the mid 1800s, it was, in Norway, the Norwegian girls would not reach their first menstruation until, after 17 years of age, or around 17 years of age on average. And so now, going up to the last point of the data that we have in this chart, around 1970, you can see that the ages are closer to 13 years. So from in the 1800s, people would go through puberty, or girls would go through puberty at 16 or 17 years of age, reaching their first menstruation, becoming reproductive in later adolescence. And now we become reproductive as females around the age of 12 or 13 in many cases. One other thing I want to point out, you can see in a couple of countries, it's just starting to level out at the end of this graph. So Norway, you can see, between 1950 and 1970, it's kind of flattened out. And there's a little bit of a flattening with the United Kingdom, in around 1960, it starts to flatten out. And this has been the trend, is that there has been, it's not still declining in most countries, but it is in the United States. First of all, why has the rate gone down over the last 100 years, or over this 100-year period? Well, this is mainly due to factors such as improved nutrition. So with improved nutrition, we've become healthier. Just improved health and health services. I mean, and things like vaccines, and we've become healthier. So we eat better overall. We're healthier. We have better health services, and these things, make us healthier as children and healthier as young adolescents, and healthier organisms are ready to reproduce earlier than unhealthy organisms. So as the population as a whole has become healthier and healthier, it has pushed the age down of puberty. We are ready to start, we are ready to become adults earlier. We are ready to reproduce earlier. Another thing that lowers the age is obesity. There is a lot of evidence that weight affects the timing of puberty, and that uh, heavier girls experience menarche earlier than thinner girls. And once again, this extra weight is kind of a sign of, well, I mean, it's to a certain extent, it's a sign of health. I mean, obviously, if we look at extreme obesity and things like that, that's very unhealthy. But weight gain as a whole means that you're more able, if, you know, you're more ready to reproduce and to care for an infant. You've moved out of childhood. Is kind of what the extra weight signals. So girls that have extra weight tend to reach puberty earlier than those that are lighter. Um, in extreme examples, such as competitive female athletes, like in gymnastics or swimming, they may have such a low amount of body fat that their puberty gets delayed. And so they may not actually reach puberty until later adolescence. And this is why, if you see the Olympics or other major competitions, there will be 15 and 15 or 16-year-old girls at times that really look like they haven't reached puberty and haven't gone through a growth spurt and a body change. And this is because if you keep your percent of fat down very, very low, this is a signal that you're not yet ready to reproduce, and the body delays, the brain and the body delays puberty. Some other factors about timing of puberty. Um, there's evidence that those in urban areas reach puberty earlier than those that grow up in rural areas. So what could that be about? Why is it that growing up in more of a city life versus country life, causes you to reach puberty earlier? Well, let me give you another factor. Those that have a lot of family stress, um, that grow up in family stress tend to reach puberty earlier as well. And this is so both of these examples, growing up in an urban area or being in a more stressful family environment, involve a more stressful life, a faster pace of life in a sense. So growing up in city life is more stressful, it's faster paced. We become ready for childbearing at an earlier age. And so there's something about the stress of your childhood and how fast paced and stressful your life is that can affect puberty, the timing of puberty at least. Okay, so healthier means younger, being heavier means younger, living in somewhat more of a stressful environment means reaching puberty younger. And all these things contribute to what we see in this graph here. Certainly, the speed of life has increased. Over the decades, we have more heaviness in our society than in past decades, and we have improved nutrition and health. Um, and finally, just to finish off this previous slide here, you can see the range of time at the bottom of the screen for when puberty begins. And there is a wide range. In boys it can begin anywhere between, as it says here, 10 and 13 and a half years, and it will tend to end between 13 up to 17 years of age. So somewhere between about 10 and 13 and a half, and it begins between 13 and 17. It ends for boys. Once again, for girls it's slightly earlier. It begins as early as 9 on average. It can be earlier. There is something called precocious puberty that, younger than 9, that girls may experience puberty. But for an average healthy girl, it will begin anywhere between 9 and 15 years of age, or at least that is the range of when it will begin and end. usually between 9 and 15 years of age. Okay. So that you can see there's a wide variation here. It's not the same from one person to another. There's wide variability in when it begins and ends for each individual adolescent. And these ages here are considered normal ranges. Okay, going on. There are often body image issues associated with puberty. Preoccupation is already a strong throughout adolescence. Many studies show that it is a major issue that adolescents think about, and certainly puberty really changes your body. I mean, it's a major, you know, a major, okay, just once again, major change, a major growth and change of your how your body looks, and many girls are not, as it says here, they're not happy with their new bodies. We, as a society, we push the idea of of thinness and within females as being a sign of beauty, that thin is beautiful, and this idea gets pushed in the media and in the television shows and movies, and so as girls go through the growth spurt and they they gain more fat cells and their bodies broaden, um, and expand in certain ways. This is often very troublesome and creates negative body images for females. Um, it can have Boys may also experience some forms of negative body issues, but it's much more serious with females. Um, this is one of the factors certainly that's associated with the higher rate of depression among adolescent girls versus boys. Adolescent girls have about 3 times the rate of depression as adolescent boys do. And one of the things that contributes to that higher female rate of depression is this negative body image that more females experience than males do. Okay. Um, there are differences in outcomes depending on whether uh, an adolescent experiences puberty earlier or later. And so there have been studies, for instance, the Berkeley longitudinal study. This was some years ago. I don't have an exact year, but Berkeley longitudinal study, examined the differences between early versus late maturing boys. And they found that early maturing boys viewed themselves more positively. They had more successful peer relations. But the later maturing boys, as it says here, had a stronger sense of identity in their 30s. So during adolescence, the late maturing boys, and I can tell you, I was one of them, and it sucked, and I hated it. The late maturing boys did not do well during adolescence. They did not enjoy being late matures. They tended to have less leadership roles. They tended to not do as well in their friendships and their romantic relationships. But something about maturing late gave them, kind of gave them an extended time to establish their identity and figure out who they were and spend more time looking inwards rather than being popular and being more social like the early maturing boys tended to do. And this is what may have contributed to their stronger sense of identity by the time they were into their 30s. That something about maturing later actually helped them figure themselves out better in a sense. And so there seemed to be a long-term positive effect of late maturity, even though the early effects favored the early maturing boys. Okay, what about girls, early versus late maturing girls? Think about which group would be at risk more of negative outcomes. The evidence is that early maturing girls are the most at risk group. More so than either the early or late maturing boys. More so than the late maturing girls. The early maturing girls, um, have a number of negative possible outcomes that's associated with being the first in your peer group to reach maturity and to go through a growth spurt and to go through puberty. I remember the boys are a couple of years behind the girls, so if you're an early maturing girl, you're not just ahead of the other girls. I mean, you're well ahead of all the boys as well. You're going to stand out amongst your peer group, amongst your grade level. Here's a list of things that have been associated with girls reaching puberty at a younger age. Um, okay, more likely to smoke, drink, be depressed, have fear disorders, more likely to have an eating disorder. We'll talk about eating disorders later in this chapter. Um, more likely to struggle for earlier independence. They tend to be more likely to have older friends. That makes sense. I mean, um, and they particularly for things like dating relationships. I mean, the older boys are then are going to look towards the early maturing girls, not the late maturing girls that still look like they're younger children. But so the early maturing girls get noticed obviously earlier. So they tend to have older friends. Including dating relationships, they tend to have sexual intercourse earlier. More at risk for physical and verbal abuse in dating. That's likely to graduate from high school. They may cohabit and marry earlier, and this is all associated with just going through puberty early. Um, so as this final point here kind of sums up some of it. That physical maturity does not equal cognitive maturity, and girls may get involved with problem behaviors with long-term negative effects. So early maturing girls, they look older than what they are cognitively, in a sense. So a girl that starts to go through puberty at 9, let's say 9 years of age, and is one of the first in her peer groups. I mean, she still has the childlike mind, and yet she will look, much older than her maturity would dictate. So this is what causes problems in the long run, is for the early maturing girls. Okay. Um, I'm not really going to. You guys can look at this and read about it on your own in the book. This is just looking at some body image issues for early and late maturing girls. And now I want to talk about changes in the brain in adolescence. Um, there are 4 major areas I want to speak about. First of all, the corpus callosum. This is the band of fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. We can see it in the picture here, kind of pictured in blue in the center there. So it's right in the middle of the brain, and it runs, from the left to the right hemispheres. It's the only thing that connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain. So you once again you have 2 halves of a brain. This one band of fibers is what connects them. So all the communication between the 2 hemispheres goes through the corpus callosum. This thickens during adolescence. This makes the brain more efficient. You can send messages back and forth quicker, and so the brain works more quickly as the corpus callosum thickens in adolescence. Okay, then we have the limbic system. It's a part of the brain where emotions and rewards are processed. And part of the limbic system is the amygdala. And we think of this as the seat of our emotions, where our emotions originate. Going to the graph, to the picture here, excuse me, you can see the limbic system, kind of once again around the center of the brain. The amygdala is a small structure colored purple. So the limbic system, once again, it's the seat of emotions and where we experience rewards. And as this matures early in adolescence, including the amygdala maturing early in adolescence, we become capable of stronger emotions. And this is one of the hallmarks of going through puberty and having the limbic system and the amygdala mature, is that all of a sudden, young adolescents are much more emotional. They experience emotions differently and more intensely. And it is the maturation of the limbic system and the amygdala that leads to this. And so with the maturity of this system in early adolescence, the adolescent becomes much more capable of strong emotions and new types of pleasure. Um, we have a kind of a counterbalance system in the brain where we have a part of the brain that helps to rein in those emotions, that helps to control them and control your impulses and to regulate those strong emotions. And this is the prefrontal cortex. Um, so it's I've mentioned it before. It's at the very front of the frontal lobe, right behind your forehead, and it's involved in reasoning, decision making, self control, planning, you know, impulse control, and this prefrontal cortex, also known as a judgment region of the brain, it reins in intense emotions. The problem is it's not done developing until late adolescence and even early adulthood. Um, this is the last part of the brain that finish, that finishes development in the early 20s. There's still myelination going on into your 20s. And so, anyways, this is a later maturing part of the brain. So we have the limbic system and the amygdala. They mature early. Emotions become rampant. Emotions become more intense. You get moodiness. You get flare-ups among younger adolescents and middle-aged adolescents. You get a lack of self-control, and this can lead to risk-taking behaviors. So this is a biological explanation of why risk-taking behaviors peak in adolescence. It is the time period between the limbic system and the amygdala finishing their development and when the prefrontal cortex finishes developing later. And so you have this window where one system, the limbic system with the amygdala, is kind of is further advanced, more mature, and leads to the intense emotions that we're not ready to control yet. And that's why we do risk taking behavior in adolescence, and that's why we are moody and we can't control our emotions, and we get increase in things like depression and anxiety. Um, okay. The other thing that's happening is that during puberty, we have a change in our neurotransmitter levels, and one in particular that changes radically is our dopamine system, and it increases in both the prefrontal cortex and in the limbic system. And this increase in dopamine also has been linked to risk-taking behavior. The use of addictive drugs is connected with the increase in dopamine, and also reward-seeking behaviors. So the dopamine increase, along with the limbic system and the amygdala finishing their development, I mean, this is what contributes to kind of the opportunity for an adolescent to seek out drugs, to start drugs, to start smoking, maybe to start drinking behavior, sexual behavior, risk-taking behavior, driving, drunk, driving too fast. I mean, it's a lot of the whole host of behaviors that we often see with adolescents until their prefrontal cortex matures enough to rein it in and control it. Now, there are certainly adolescents that don't show this behavior, and they don't show this great risk-taking behavior and risky sexual behavior and drug-taking behavior. And I mean, for some of them, the gap between the finishing of the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex maturing enough may be shorter. And if some people may have the prefrontal cortex mature earlier, and they can control their emotions more than others. And so there is a kind of a biological basis, and it used to be that we just assumed that it was mainly social cultural kinds of factors that led to risk taking behavior, and it was just kind of that age where you were, you're getting closer to adulthood, and because you went through puberty, um, you feel like you want to try new behaviors. I mean, it was a while before we realized that it was really biologically based and had to do with these particular brain systems. Okay. Anyways, a long explanation there, but I always sorry, I'm trying to finish, but I always found this fascinating myself when I finally learned about it, and it really does explain a lot about adolescent behavior, and it as when we become adults, we and our prefrontal cortex is fully mature. I mean, we all can control our behaviors. I want to have I might want to have unprotected sex, but I can think about it and say, no, that's not a good idea. Or I might think about driving after having a couple of drinks. I can think about it and say, no, that's a bad idea. I can plan ahead, I can reason, and we have that ability much more in adulthood than we do during adolescence. Okay, adolescent sexuality is the next topic. I'm going to go through some of these slides fairly quickly here, and so it's a time of sexual exploration and experimentation in adolescence. Your sexual feelings are awoken with puberty. Um, you become curious, and so certainly adolescence is a time about learning about your sexual identity and and learning just how you plan to be, what kind of sexual being you plan to be, I guess. And so adolescents experiment and try out different things. You develop a sexual identity by doing this over time, by maybe taking some chances at times, or not chances, but like I'm not talking about risky sexual behavior, but by experimenting, like maybe going out of your comfort zone to try different things, and you try dating, you try asking people out, and you learn about with how you are as a sexual being. Typically, this happens during adolescence. Um, like your sexual identity includes your activities and interests, your style of behavior, your sexual orientation. Um, Gay males and lesbians experience early same-sex attractions in many cases. Um, it's a one typical pattern is that they've had a long time dealing with same-sex attractions. Many gay males and lesbians can kind of draw it back to maybe even childhood for some, or at least to early adolescence. That's one pattern where it kind of develops early, and they always kind of know, and during adolescence they come to grips with it. So that's one particular pattern. Another pattern is that they don't have same-sex attraction, as it says here, until after adolescence. There are those that have no real indication, or they don't really have any idea until they're into their 20s, and perhaps they're in college or university, and it's something there gives them an abrupt realization of their same-sex attraction. Something happens. Um, I had a good friend in university that this happened with, and um, I was I was actually dating this woman, and then over time, I mean, she just came to realize. I mean, it was out of the blue that she preferred girls, and you know had same sex had same sex attraction and interests. Um, and it was very interesting to kind of going through it with her, and her discovery of it. Anyways, so there are different patterns as far as when it same-sex attraction really be when people become aware of it, I should say. And then there's even patterns where it can be later in life that people discover a same sex attraction. So there's not one pattern for when it develops or how it develops. Okay, let me see what else here. I'm not going to go through the specific numbers at the bottom. You guys can look at them yourself and read about them more in the book. You can see that in this chart that there's been a decrease in sexual activity if we compare 1991 to 2015 among adolescents. And this was 9th to 12th grades that were studied, and you see, these are percentages. How many had ever had sexual intercourse? Asked, and it's down to 41% from 54%. So this is like a 25-year period or so. Currently sexually active, the numbers are down. Had sexual intercourse before the age of 13, far less compared to 1991. So, and also those that have multiple partners, 4 or more persons, that's down as well. So every one of these statistics went down from 1991 to 2015. And so think about, what may have led to that. What things changed between 1991 and 2015 that could account for people being less readily sexually active in their teenage years. There are a number of ideas that have been put forth to account for this. One of the major ones is I'm just going to talk about one of the major ones, and that is really the proliferation of knowledge about AIDS, which really, in 1991, it was still relatively new and people didn't understand it, and it wasn't well advertised and wasn't well known. But certainly there was a push during the 90s where AIDS, when I say push, there was an education campaign that came about during the 90s about AIDS. And people became much more aware of it. People became scared of it. It was a disease with no cure. For a long time, it seemed like a virtual death sentence. It was, we have better drugs now to help control it and things like that. But back in the earlier years, it was just a scary, scary disease. It's one of the ideas put forth is that there was a shift in a generational kind of shift with AIDS becoming kind of the worst of the sexually transmitted infections, and that it changed people's sexual behaviors, and that our whole society became more careful in sexual behaviors. And this led to these decreases in numbers that adolescents are more careful than and are brought up to be more careful than they were in past generations. Okay. Sexual initiation varies by ethnic group. I'm not really going to speak to that, but there are some changes now compared to the past. Oral sex is more common than in the past. Certainly, the sequence has shifted. Oral sex was something that was kind of approached later in relationships. Back, certainly when I was younger, in part of my generation, oral sex was something that came later. You were much more likely to initially have sexual intercourse before you ever approached the topic of oral sex. Now the sequence has shifted. Many people start with oral sex before they have, penis vaginal intercourse and into other forms of sex. So it's really shifted and become more common. And this also, they believe, was affected by AIDS, in that because the rate of transmission is less risky. It certainly is still risky with oral sex, but it's less risky than with vaginal sex, and so we have shifted in our sequences, and many people, see oral sex as not a big deal now compared to past years where it was kind of, it was once again more kind of taboo. It came later. Many adults, didn't think it was appropriate and things like that. So, okay, I don't want to dwell on it, but there are, certain area sexual behaviors have shifted in adolescence. Risk factors in adolescent sexual behavior: drug use, delinquency, school related problems, socioeconomic status, having a lower one, um, issues with families and peers. There's various factors that determine who does or who doesn't have sex in adolescence, and like the timing, when do you have sex initially, and so these are all things that are related. When they're called risk factors, there are certain factors that make it more likely that you'll have sex earlier in adolescence. Um, this there's a list at the very bottom here of certain negatives that are associated with very early sexual debut. So intercourse before the age of 13. So things like sexual risk taking, substance use, violent victimization, suicidal thoughts and attempts. These are all been associated with very early sex. So, and obviously, these are a lot of very negative outcomes. So, uh, it's not considered a positive thing to have an early debut of sexual intercourse, before the age of 13. And this is just, if you think about it, people are just not very mature before the age of 13. They're not ready for a sexual life. And this is why it's associated with many negatives. Um, Things that lower the chance that an adolescent will engage in earlier sexual behavior. And these are positives that lower risk factors, and um, certainly family connectedness. Studies show that when parents foster a close and supportive relationship with their teenagers, if they have that in place, it's a protective factor. Adolescents are much less likely to be seeking the love and comfort of others when they have a close connection with their parents. Um, you can see other ones mentioned here. Communication between parents and adolescents is obviously important. Parental monitoring, if that's higher, at a higher level, the adolescent's less likely to engage in sex. Partner connectedness is a good relationship between parents. Between your parents, you see a good relationship between them. It makes it more likely that you'll wait for a good relationship before engaging in sex yourself. So, anyways, these are all protective factors. Contraceptive use: adolescents do not consistently use contraceptives, and even with all of our education and things like that, I mean, our numbers still aren't great. They've gotten better. Let me see what I have here. I've got in 2015, the figure is 14% reported that they did not use contraceptives during their last sexual encounter. Once again, this adolescents that were surveyed, so 14%. But this number was at 34% in 2011. So it has dropped tremendously. 14% is still considered too high. We would like all of our adolescents using contraceptives, but anyways, it certainly has come down a fair bit. 34% was ridiculously high in 2011. It was down to 14% in 2015. So that's a good sign. Um, some organizations are calling for adolescents to perhaps use long-acting reversible contraceptives, LARCs. These are, like IUDs, which are intrauterine devices that protect against pregnancy, or contraceptive implants. So these are long-lasting devices where you don't have to do something each time you have sex like you would do with using a condom or using pills. You have to take them each day, and so these long-lasting devices can be kind of inserted and forgot about, and they can protect the teenager over the course of years. So many people suggest, that this would be a good idea to kind of try to get our try to get more teenagers to use these long acting contraceptives devices. U.S. teens are less likely to use contraceptives than their European counterparts. Um, okay, and those long-acting reversible contraceptions have a much lower risk of pregnancy compared to birth control pills or condoms. Much lower risk of pregnancy. And I mention that because our pregnancy rate is very high in the United States. We'll talk about that in a moment. Quickly stopping here for STIs. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. They're contacted through sex. I'm sure people are aware of that, including oral genital and anal genital contact. Over 3 million American adolescents acquire an STI each year. This is about 1 in 4 American adolescents get an STI. Of those that are sexually active, I should say, not just 1 in 4, but out of those that are sexually active, one out of every 4. Adolescent pregnancy, as I mentioned, we have a very high rate in the U.S. It's, as it says here, one of the highest teen pregnancy and birth rates in the industrialized world. It's 8 times as high as in the Netherlands, just as a comparison. 8 times the rate, even though we're not more sexually active in the United States than the teenagers in the Netherlands. So equal level of sexual activity, but we have 8 times more teenage pregnancies. So I just using that country as a comparison, think about why the difference in the rates. What is it that's different in one country versus another that leads to such different pregnancy rates? And if you look, if you look at comparisons between the United States and Canada, or France, or Great Britain, I mean, we are at least double the rates of all those countries, and in some cases, we're 4 times the rate. I mean, like, our rate is really, really very different than most European countries. I'm gonna just ask you to think about the reasons and read the textbook. I'm not going to just give them to you, but consider what would make one country's rate different than another. Okay, there are teen pregnancies. Obviously, can create problems for both the baby and the mother. Some of the issues associated with teenage pregnancy: low birth weight, neurological problems in the infant, and more chance of childhood illness. We do see increased illness rates in children of adolescent mothers. Most mothers drop out of school, never catch up economically. In fact, I mean, most were not good students before they became pregnant. And this is one of the things that can lead to them becoming pregnant as teenagers. That if they don't have a bright academic future, if they're not looking ahead to college or university, or they don't have a specific career in mind. I mean, this is one of the things that leads to teenage pregnancies, is a lack of a future that one looks forward to. When you're looking forward to a future, you tend to take more care of yourself and tend to be more careful during adolescence. So once again, most were not good students, and once they become pregnant, they drop out of school, and they tend to work low-paying jobs, obviously. Adolescent mothers often have depression and a second child, but education and the long-acting contraceptives helps the rates of both. This is particularly true, having a second child, and suffering from depression is particularly true of more so of African American and Latina adolescent mothers compared to non-Latino white mothers. And this may be that they were already in a lower socioeconomic status to begin with, and this is with the pregnancy, this can contribute to the depression and to going on to having another child. A couple more points. Teenage mothers interact less effectively with their infants compared to adult mothers, so they're not as good parents. Um, the daughters of teenage mothers are at increased risk for teenage childbearing themselves when they grow up. So they're more likely, if you have those that have daughters, are more likely to become teenage mothers themselves. And this is the idea of the mental model. Once again, I've spoken about this before, that during childhood we often form a mental model. And I talked about this when I spoke about attachment. It was a mental model of our first good relationship. Well, similarly here, you form a mental model of what it's like, what parenthood is like. And if you have a teenage mother, particularly, one that may be unpartnered, and as is the case in many cases, I mean, like, this is kind of setting a model about, okay, my mother had me when she was a teenager. I could have a baby when I'm a teenager. So it just kind of makes it more normal and easier to go there when that child becomes a teenager themselves. And one last thing, I guess, before I leave here, one figure: 82% of pregnancies to teenage mothers between 15 and 19 years of age are unintended. 82% of them are unintended. So these are not well thought out, planned decisions. These are the results of what I was talking about earlier: risk-taking behavior and not the immature prefrontal cortex, so a lack of planning, lack of impulse control, lack of good decision making. All those are caused by an immature prefrontal cortex, and this is one of the things leading to teenage pregnancies. 82% unintended. Okay. Next slide. And the good news is that the U.S. adolescent birth rate is declining. We're still, once again, very much higher than most other countries, industrialized countries, but you can see it going down, and that is certainly positive. Okay, and this ends video 1. Video 2 will start with issues in adolescent health.